Welcome to Four Corners. Tonight's story will be new territory for most Australians. We've heard a great deal about organ donations over many years. Most people support the concept, although the number of donors falls well short of the demand for organs. What we know much less about is the demand for other human tissue, including bones, tendons, skin and heart valves. They're implanted to assist with sports or other injuries, or for burns victims or dental work, or they can be converted into other medical products. In recent years, demand has in fact exploded. Later in the program, we're going to examine what happens with the trade in human tissue in Australia, where we're hopelessly short of supply. But first, a shocking expose of what amounts to organised body snatching in Eastern Europe on a staggering scale, to remove human tissue for commercial trade to more affluent parts of the globe, particularly America. Some of the products of this unscrupulous trade may even be finding their way here, despite the strict rules covering the domestic industry. The human tissue industry is now worth billions of dollars, but even so, there simply aren't enough bodies to meet demand. This report comes from two German filmmakers, Martina Keller and Wolfgang Luck, who teamed up with journalists in Germany, the Ukraine and the United States to expose a scandal involving forensic pathologists, high-ranking government officials and at least one major American corporation. There are some scenes in the story you may find confronting.
The brave new world of medicine in an advert. If you tear a tendon, don't worry, the spare part is already at hand. But few of us know that many medical implants are made from dead bodies. A billion-dollar market with a dirty secret. Because there aren't enough donors around, the medical industry illegally butchers cadavers in Eastern Europe. In the Ukraine, pathologists are accused of harvesting body parts under scandalous circumstances.
On the day of the funeral, I saw that my son had cuts on his wrists, very deep cuts. They had cut out body parts.
We've teamed up with Ukrainian and American colleagues to investigate the scandal. In court files, we find clues for an international network of body snatchers. Alexander Lini is a reporter and presenter for the Ukrainian TV channel ICTV. Only a few dare to speak up in a country without real freedom of the press. As a Ukrainian, Alexander can get us into places that otherwise would be off limits for us. Without him, we wouldn't be able to make this film. We're on our way to one of the centers of the body trade, the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Kiev. In the Ukraine, autopsies are performed routinely every time somebody dies, a relic of socialist times when the government even tried to keep the dead under control. Well-stocked morgues. This is what makes the Ukraine so attractive for body snatchers. For weeks, we tried to get interviews with those responsible, and for weeks, we were fobbed off. Now we try a more direct approach.
Уважаемый, а что мы снимаем?
Здрасте.
Здравствуйте. Вот так зашли и просто снимаем.
А что это за...
We ask for the head of the institute.
Да? Режимный? А что тогда турникеты?
He's not here right now.
Режимные, просто...
When can we meet him? No idea.
Охраны нет вообще.
His deputy makes it clear to us that he doesn't want a film crew sniffing around.
Не знаю. Я знаю перечень режимных объектов.
Do you have a filming permit? No, you haven't even replied to our emails. You know you can't film here. So get out, fast. Here in Kiev alone, 8,000 corpses are processed at the Institute of Forensic Medicine each year. What exactly happens with them is a well-guarded secret. We continue our search for clues on the internet. On the website of the US-American Food and Drug Administration, we find a database. It's a list of Ukrainian forensic institutes that process human tissue and send it abroad. The evidence for a nationwide network for harvesting corpses.
Donetsk, Gorlovka, Ivano-Frankovsk, Kharkov. Next.
There's a list, there's another 10.
Херсон, Киев, судебно-медицинская экспертиза, например.
Then a surprise. If you want to call a Ukrainian corpse dealer, you have to dial a phone number starting with 49.
Бюро судебно-медицинской экспертизы. Номер, код не Украины.
Not a single Ukrainian phone number. They all have the German prefix 49.
After 49, the number continues with 9134, the area code for the German town of Neunkirchen. The number belongs to the German company Tütingen. They make implants from body parts.
Among its many wonders, the human body possesses remarkable healing power. That's what drives the people of RTI Biologics.
RTI is Tütingen's American parent company. They use Galitzi advertising to sell, for example, Achilles tendons made from cadavers.
Sterilization technologies to repair and facilitate.
There's a legal market for such products. For example, tissue donors in Germany can assume that their body parts are processed correctly by a network of non-profit tissue banks and processing companies.
Human tissue and xenograft tissue for
But some commercial outfits like Tütingen and RTI make a profit with human tissue.
fracture and joint repair, sports
They get their raw
medicine,
material
and
from
orthopedic
Eastern
and
Europe
specialty surgery.
and sell their products around the world.
Why do you think companies choose to process body parts from the Ukraine?
Ну, я уже сказал, в принципе, потому что у нас, видно, проще всего как бы обойти закон в этом плане, да?
Because obviously our justice system is not working properly, and it's very difficult to control what is legal and what is illegal.
В Германии, там, может быть, или в Америке, за этим более серьезный контроль.
In Europe or America, you have much tighter controls. There's a lot of money in the tissue market, so our forensic pathologists are happy to get involved in this business.
Ну, такие вещи.
In the future, we want you to donors that are under 66 years old, 60 up to 65.
This is an excerpt from a training video for forensic pathologists. An American expert teaches Ukrainian colleagues. He explains which parts of the corpses are particularly valuable, how to take them out correctly, and how to package them for further processing. Because the authorities in Kiev turned down our requests for more information, we travel 400 kilometers to the east, to the industrial town of Krivoy Rog. In 2008, prosecutors started investigations against body snatchers in Krivoy Rog. The tissue harvesting was stopped and a court case was opened. Alexander has learned that the court files could tell us more about the scandal. After half a day of negotiations and frequently mentioning public interest, the judge is ready to talk in front of the camera. She says that the defendant was the head of the Department of Forensic Medicine. He was accused of butchering dead bodies without permission and deceiving relatives. He died shortly before the verdict, and the case was closed without any convictions. We ask whether the evidence would have been sufficient for a conviction. She can only tell us this much. There is a long list of victims. Most of them had indeed signed a form stating that tissue can be removed from the bodies of their relatives. The only question is, how have they been tricked?
Вот в Украине я очень часто езжу по судам, ну вот просто у вас и глава,
And then the judge wants to prove that she really tried to investigate the corpse scandal. Surprisingly, she suddenly allows us to read the court documents. Here we find evidence for the involvement of the international medical industry. Again and again, the documents mention Tütingen, the German subsidiary of the American company RTI. Page after page of body parts that were harvested for the international market.
You have now seen these files for the first time. What have you learned?
Да, когда я первый раз заглянул в уголовное дело, которое здесь слушалось в этом суде,
The real surprise for me is the extent of the scandal.
этого бизнеса меня очень сильно поразили.
In this district alone, pathologists have taken out around 1,000 body parts per month and sent them to Kiev.
Частей тела, которые были отправлены вот в Киев, которые были собраны здесь.
These aren't isolated incidents. The records show very clearly that corpses were butchered systematically, sometimes more, sometimes less. But this is obviously big business, and most body parts were shipped to Germany.
Месяц отправлялось в Киев, ну и, соответственно, потом в Германию.
In the court files, we find the names and addresses of some of the witnesses. This leads us to a couple who testified in the trial against the forensic pathologist. A suburb of Krivoy Rog. After some hesitation, the Malish family agrees to do an interview. On the 9th of April 2008, their son Sergei committed suicide in the garage of the apartment block. He was 19. What happened after that was a further shock for the parents that they still haven't managed to overcome.
Вызвали милицию, естественно, приехали милиция приехала и...
When we found Sergei's body, we called the police immediately. They came very quickly and brought people from the Department of Pathology with them. While the police interrogated me, the forensic pathologist took my weeping wife to the side and shoved some forms in her face.
Разрешение на изъятие органов.
Когда брали показания у мужа, милиция.
It all happened so fast, I didn't understand. 2 women gave me a paper to sign. For an autopsy, I asked. Yes, they said. I did ask my husband, why do they want to open his body? It's obvious that he's hanged himself.
Я еще мужа просила, говорю, зачем его вскрывать? Тут же и так понятно, что случилось. В день похорон. Я видела, что у него на руках раны.
On the day of the funeral, I saw that my son had cuts on his wrists, very deep cuts. And my husband said that they had cut out body parts.
Они увидели, что здоровый молодой парень, есть что брать.
They probably thought, this is a young guy, we can take a lot out.
Изымали.
One single body is worth up to $250,000 if it's exploited and marketed systematically. So the dead serve as spare part shops for the living, and as a treasure trove for dubious profiteers. We visit our Ukrainian colleague in his office in Kiev. He shows us why the authorities don't stop these macabre acts. Bio-Implant, the Ukrainian company making money by harvesting body parts for RTI and Tütingen, belongs to the Ministry of Health. So the controlling authority controls itself. Therefore, nobody is interested in stopping this lucrative business. For over a decade, Igor Alashenko has been organizing the supply of bodies. This has made him a wealthy man. Here he tells forensic pathologists that they've got nothing to worry about. He says that even the Pope has an organ donor card. Donating body parts for the sick. This is an act of love and affection. We would have liked to speak about this in person with Mr. Alashenko. For weeks, we've been asking for an interview with the Ukrainian key player in the body trading business.
Здравствуйте. Это Александр Ильиных, журналист телекомпании ICTV. Скажите, я с господином Олещенко смог бы поговорить? Я понял. Хорошо, я перезвоню тогда. Спасибо.
And again,
Да,
Alexander is fobbed off by the assistant.
Постоянно, как бы он или в командировке, или он куда-то уехал.
Again, she said that he's away on business. This seems to be a very long business trip because every time I call him, he's not there. I've never met him personally. They seal him off completely.
Не видел, как бы за это время.
Those responsible in the Ukraine are playing hard to get. But what about their international business partners? We continue our search in the German town of Neunkirchen. Here, the Ukrainian body parts are sterilized and turned into medical implants. Tutagen agreed to do an interview. Proudly, the new American CEO presents their products.
So start with our best seller, which is the particulate. We sell the particulate, which is cancellous, and it's derived from primarily the iliac crest in the hip, as well as the femoral head. We use this particulate to fill voids left in bone from hip surgery, from knee surgery. We also use quite a bit in dental, where it's used to fill socket. We have an unparalleled track record of success, safety, efficacy, dependability. We absolutely respect the gift of donation. You see it in everything we do, from the consent process to processing and how we handle the donor families.
When we reveal that we've seen quite the opposite in the Ukraine, Tutagen's CEO asks a representative of the American parent company, RTI, to the table.
He didn't have the time to come today. He asked me to show it to you.
We explain about the court documents in Krivoy Rog and play back the testimonies of the witnesses.
Мужа просила, говорю, зачем его вскрывать? Тут же и так понятно, что случилось.
So this was just one of several things they did. Many people told the similar cases. I just wanted to ask you about your impressions when you see it.
It's very sad and disappointing. I think what that is showing is that families are not possibly fully understanding what they're being asked to consent for. They're not thinking correctly. They're not thinking straight, and then they are.
But in a situation like this, you cannot think correctly when
well, sometimes they just say no, and sometimes they regret that. Sometimes they say yes, and sometimes they regret that. It's terribly sad for families when that happens. Terribly sad, and we understand that. And
these are tricks they use just to get the signature on the paper.
But I don't really believe that. And if you understood the numbers of donors versus the numbers of people that die, there are a tiny proportionate number of donors, which is why we believe that if it were more culturally understood, this would not be new to them. They would be prepared for these kinds of questions, and this is where we believe that.
But the problem lies in the people in your partners who come and tell and show them the papers in a situation like this. In Germany, it would be absolutely forbidden to act in this way.
To show them papers for consent?
To come to a mother whose son just committed suicide 1 hour ago and show them papers and say, no, please sign it?
The timing is more critical when people don't understand what's happening. And I think to Robbie's point, you know, where the more awareness, the more education, the more they understand what's happening, the better they are prepared to answer the questions, to make their response.
But do I understand you read that you only see the problem on the side of the families who don't understand it? Isn't it a problem of your partners who act in this way?
No, not at all. I'm not at all blaming the families. It's very saddening to us when it happens in our industry, because we're here to help recipients and to serve donor families' wishes, not to go against donor families' wishes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have water in there.
Tissue is then packaged, and bone allografts are terminally sterilized in the final package. Bone allografts are distributed to surgeons sterile.
In the adverts of RTI, everything looks neat and tidy.
The BioCleanse process.
The message is clear. Products made from body parts are safe and clean.
Providing a clean scaffold to facilitate bone remodeling. Safety and innovation, such as BioCleanse, RTI is committed to providing better options for surgical patients.
We're continuing our research in New York. America is the biggest market for human tissue. The US tissue industry has an annual turnover of more than $1 billion. And RTI is one of its biggest players. In the United States, doctors perform more than 1 million tissue transplants every year. Implants like this one are used, as in this case, for knee operations, or hip surgery and spinal fusions. Human tissue is a bestseller, but the demand far outstrips the supply. Here in New York, only 18% of the population are registered as organ or tissue donors. So the tissue industry constantly thinks about new ways of sourcing raw material. And some companies more interested in making a profit than following the law are willing to use criminal methods to get hold of body parts. A few years ago, a gruesome story hit the headlines. A failed dental surgeon had illegally stolen body parts in funeral homes. He had ripped apart 1,000 cadavers and sold their parts to tissue banks around the country. Michael Mastromarino was at the heart of the scandal. He had the idea to harvest body parts in morgues. He worked with funeral directors, whom he paid $1,000 per body. His company supplied raw material to tissue banks. One of his biggest customers was RTI. It was a runaway success. The snag was that Mastromarino didn't care to ask relatives for their consent. He replaced the stolen bones with plastic pipes so families wouldn't notice they were missing. In many cases, he falsified consent forms and didn't care about the medical history of the bodies. We've traveled to meet William Hale, a former New York City police detective. A few years ago, he had surgery on his spine after a car accident. A bone part was inserted in his neck that Mastromarino had taken out of a cadaver and sold on to RTI for processing. Some months later, William Hale got a letter that changed his life.
I just was going to get the mail, like every day. Got a letter from the New York State Department of Health, and it said in there that the bone part that was in my neck came from this cadaver, and this cadaver was positive for hepatitis C. And that was pretty much how I found out that there was something wrong with it. Then I was like, what's going on? And then I found out more.
Hale endured monthly blood tests for a year, but luckily he didn't test positive for hepatitis C. His case was dismissed in court, but he still worries about his future health because of the implant in his neck.
Who knows how long it was going on for, and if it's happened other times that we don't even know about. You know, nobody knows unless you get caught. And I'm sure this would have kept going on and on and on until, you know, if the people never got caught. But, you know, I guess when greed sets in, that's when things slip up.
Michael Mastromarino is serving up to 50 years in prison. He says he wants to apologize to the victims, but he also feels that he's been unfairly treated. He says the big tissue processors like RTI are also to blame because they pushed him to get more and more raw material.
My tissue was sold before I had it. In the beginning, they helped me with everything. They were the ones that gave me the paperwork. They were the ones that showed me what I needed to fill out. They were the ones that gave me the instrumentation. They paid for all the supplies. They wanted the tissue, they wanted the bone, and they were going to do anything possible to make sure that we were successful in doing that.
As far as you can tell, did any of those processors ever check a single donor file to confirm the information was accurate?
In the beginning, when all this was set up, they said none of the paperwork was going to be verified. I mean, you could slice it any way you want, but at the end of the day is, you know, I knew and they knew that the paperwork wasn't going to be verified. I think I myself sit here, I'm in prison, and given what transpired over these past 4 years, I think the industry as a whole has a tendency of making themselves out to be more altruistic than what they really are.
Among its many wonders, the human body possesses remarkable healing power. And RTI Biologics is dedicated to complementing that power through innovations in biologics.
The tissue industry likes to point out that its products are only used for surgery that is medically necessary. But even that's a lie, as we found out.
And other tissues to help people live fuller, healthier lives.
This fasciolata. Fasciolata is recovered from it's the covering around muscle tissue, and this is human in nature, human derived. This material is used for a number of purposes, but our primary use for it clinically is for head and neck repairs. So for dural repairs, when they have surgical repairs they have to do to the cranium, they will use this as a covering to protect.
I heard it's also used for plastic surgery in nose operations, for example, too.
No, we don't use this for plastic surgery. The only plastic surgery product that we utilize, we ship to Asia. We do offer this product for example, for breast reconstruction. So then there's a cancer surgery and it has to be completely reconstructed. And so, you know, we wouldn't consider that cosmetic in nature.
No body parts for cosmetic surgery? We heard something different and went to Hamburg in northern Germany to find out more. One of the leading plastic surgeons here is willing to talk to us about human tissue. The surgeon has asked us not to be shown. The subject is not very helpful in attracting new customers. This patient is willing to pay 6,000 euros for a nicer nose. Here we see something that doesn't exist, according to Tutogen. Their products being used in a beauty clinic.
Do you often use human tissue?
Yes, of course, regularly.
Funny, Tutogen told us they wouldn't sell their products to plastic surgeons.
But we order it on a regular basis without any problems.
Is it only you who uses this material, or do your colleagues use it too?
We all use that. It's standard procedure.
Do you tell your patients?
Would you undergo surgery if you knew that you get an implant from a corpse?
So, no explanation?
No, because from a medical point of view, it's unproblematic.
And morally or legally? Aren't you obliged to let your patients know?
Oh, well, good question. Honestly, I don't know.
Here in America, politicians try to get more control over the tissue traders. After the Mastromarino scandal, The senator for New York called for a law to better oversee the tissue banking industry. Our American reporter colleague, Thomas Mayer, went to interview the senator, whose Safe Tissue Act was never put into law.
Well, the industry was opposed to it. They said it wasn't needed. They said that everything is under control, but I had real doubts.
Should the average person be concerned about that? How concerned should
Well, you should be concerned in several ways. I mean, the greatest outrage was that families didn't know that the tissues were being sold to people who died. And so there's a concern there. But second, if, you know, God forbid you need one of these tissues, you want to make sure you're getting a fully healthy part. And without regulation, you can't be sure of that.
Sir, let me ask you, one of the things that we're finding is that hospitals here in New York are using vendors that obtain cadaver parts in the Ukraine, where there have been questions raised about informed consent, that families who have found out that their loved ones' bodies have been used to provide body parts to these companies here in the United States.
This is an outrage no matter where in the world it happens. To have a loved one have their body hacked apart so that someone can use it without that family's knowledge, consent, is outrageous. And I think every institution has an obligation to check on it and be careful.
To what extent is this human body parts business part of this brave new world of medicine?
Like everywhere else, when technology allows you to do more things, it can do some very good things, but it can also allow some very bad things to happen. And our job is to make sure the bad things don't. When there's no oversight, people can skirt the law, and there's a greater need for oversight. It's improved a little bit since 2006 when we first raised this, but there needs to be a whole lot more.
And so the corpse scandal still continues. Europe and the US are still importing truckloads of donor tissue from the Ukraine. "21 Ukrainian tissue harvesting plants are still supplying raw material for profiteers in the West. And still, nobody is controlling them properly.
In Australia, the human tissue industry is in its infancy and is run mostly by not-for-profit agencies under a strict set of rules, with just one commercial operation, and that's not yet on a large scale. Surgeons in Australia can only access imported tissue products if they can't be supplied locally and only under the scrutiny of a special access scheme. The costly R&D that has driven the medical breakthrough so far may have been spurred on partly by altruism, but also substantially by the profit motive in countries where for-profit corporations are well established. So should commerce be allowed to drive the fledgling human tissue industry in Australia? And amongst the ethical questions that would throw up is this one: should the families of donors also be allowed to share in the profits? Professor Nicholas Tonti-Filippini is a bioethicist who recently chaired an advisory panel which wrote a report for the National Health and Medical Research Council examining the ethical issues. Stefan Poniatowski is the head of Victoria's Donor Tissue Bank, and they're both in our Melbourne studio. Nicholas Tonti-Filippini, how did that story impact on you?
I was concerned, obviously, that in the Ukraine it seemed there might be some coercive practices around getting consent, for one thing. And second, same as here, people who are donating tissue which is then used in a way that in trade, that is, it's bought and sold once it becomes a tissue product, are not aware of that. And that was one of our major concerns as a committee, that people at the start of the chain, people who donate tissue, are not aware that the tissue will be used to make a product that is then traded.
Stefan Poniatowski, it's not just Eastern Europe. We've seen instances in America too of improper practice. Could anything like that happen in Australia, in your view?
I suppose the question is what is the incentive to do something like that within Australia?
Certainly within our own tissue bank, we're on a not-for-profit cost recovery structure, and certainly there is no motivation or incentive for tissue to be removed without consent and fully informed consent from the family.
So how does your tissue bank go about getting its supplies?
Deaths within the community are reported through various agencies to the Donor Tissue Bank of Victoria, and we have our own team of tissue donor coordinators who are nurses who are trained to screen medical histories and also circumstances of death to determine whether a donor could potentially come out of that situation. If that's the case, then our coordinators have permission to ring the next of kin and to discuss tissue donation and the potential and the outcomes out of that donation with the family, and also describe to them what the donation procedure involves such that they can make an informed decision whether they wish to undertake tissue donation. And if they do, then that follows through to tissue retrieval within our own facility and the processing and supply of that tissue to hospitals from our facility.
And these conversations with relatives presumably take place within a very short time of death.
Certainly. We only have a small window of opportunity. We have up to 24 hours after the death of an individual to actually have the tissue removed and safely stored such that it can be made available for transplant. So it is a very acute period of grief. Many of these families are the circumstances of death are very sudden and not expected, and our coordinators are specially trained to handle that situation and to recognise stress and to give the family sufficient time to have discussions with the wider family perhaps to decide whether that's something that they wish to do or not.
And how strict is the process that guarantees that it really is informed consent and that the families are fully briefed?
Under the Human Tissue Acts, and there are various acts around the country in different states and territories, there is a requirement for us to have informed consent. The process that we have is overseen by the Ethics Committee and the Institute of Forensic Medicine, which has independent panel members who review our processes. We describe tissue donation to the family, which will involve explicitly which tissue will be removed. So, for example, for bone donation, we will describe that as bone between the hip and the ankle, for example, and maybe from the upper arm, depending on which tissues are required for surgery at that particular time. So we will explicitly describe to the family where the tissue is going to be retrieved and which tissues, and that, although all of that process happens verbally, it will be also followed up with written communication to the family about 2 weeks after the donation, which will confirm in writing what tissues were retrieved, and we will ask for a written consent after that procedure.
Nicholas Tonti-Filippini, ethically speaking, you're satisfied that the end justifies the means if all appropriate procedures are followed. In other words, medically, very real benefit is derived from this process.
Oh, not necessarily. I wouldn't say that the end justifies the means in every case. It depends on what the means is. It's a good thing to be using tissue for donation and for transplantation, but the question is somebody making a profit from it? And once tissue is turned into a product in Australia, there is no control over it. There is no agency that's responsible for ensuring that it isn't sold on to somebody. And when we talk about not-for-profit agencies, that doesn't mean that the agency doesn't draw money from selling the tissue and using that money for other ways within their not-for-profit agency. So, for instance, you might use money taken from selling a tissue product to fund research, for instance.
Are you saying that it is possible, that it would be possible under what happens now in Australia, for a practice not dissimilar to what we saw in Eastern Europe happening here? I don't mean in quite the same crude way, but that the essence of what you regard as an ethical practice could be abused, could slip through the system?
Yeah, easily, because there is nobody who's actually responsible once it becomes a tissue product. At the point at which tissue is taken from a body, there's control over that, and you can't sell that tissue unless you get permission from the health minister. But once that becomes a product, once you do something to that tissue and turn it into a product, then there is no control over it in Australia. There's no need to go to an ethics committee. There's no restraint over that once it's a product.
So in other words, it could be used for any purpose deemed necessary or okay by the surgeon?
You could use it for cosmetics, you could use it for anything once it becomes a tissue product. So things like collagen, for instance, are routinely used by cosmetic surgeons. That's made from human tissue. It's no longer cellular, but it is from human tissue.
Stefan Poniatowski, do you have a problem with the whole concept of this trade in human tissue being a commercial for-profit enterprise? Yours is non-profit. Do you have a problem with a corporation making a profit from this trade?
I think it raises alarm bells, I suppose, within the public, and that's the concern. What we would like to foresee is that people donate tissue altruistically for the benefit of the community, and we foresee our purpose to facilitate that wish and that desire from the donor and the family, and to protect and provide that tissue out to hospitals according to patient need. So from our point of view, I think anything that murkies or muddies the water with regard to potential risk with damaging that trust from society is a real potential problem, because conversely, on the other side, if the public doesn't feel that tissue is going to be treated, tissue will be treated as a commodity, then there's a risk that they will not consent to tissue donation within our society, and that the adverse effect of that will be that it will increase the number of tissues imported from other countries for which there will be less control.
But let me put this reality to you both. That the donations fall well short of the demand, and this is true globally, that there has been an explosion of demand. Isn't the reality going to be over time that if the trade or the demand is not properly met within Australia, that increasingly we will turn overseas, surgeons will turn overseas, would-be patients will turn overseas to get their product, at which point whatever chance we have in Australia of supervising a proper process becomes seriously diminished. Nicholas Tonti-Filippini?
We need to have an Australian agency that oversees the use of tissue products. It could be done by the Therapeutic Goods Authority, for instance, or it could be done by the National Health and Medical Research Council. But one of those agencies needs to be given a brief by the government to be responsible, so that if a surgeon is using a human tissue product, they have to have approval from an Australian agency, and that Australian agency then can look to the probity of where the tissue came from.
Stefan Poniatowski, what about you?
I think that what we need is public confidence within the Australian system, and there is no reason to suppose that we cannot be self-sufficient as a country, even with increasing demand. The more the public are aware of tissue donation and the fact that it's a normalised process of after-death care of an individual, if the public will support that, we can get access to more and more potential donors in an ethical and approved fashion, then essentially we should be striving to make Australia self-sufficient and promoting our donation programmes rather than relying on other sources of tissue.
But self-sufficiency means presumably access to the sophisticated products. Those products are only going to come from expensive R&D, which is not going to be driven by not-for-profit organisations. Isn't that the case?
No, that's not true, Kerry. They are already able to take a profit and use it within the not-for-profit organisation. So that at the moment they can develop these tissues in Australia, they can sell them on to the surgeons and to the hospitals, they can make a profit for them, and that's considered not-for-profit as long as that money stays within a not-for-profit organisation. And so that they can use this is a turnover of the money, so to speak.
And Nicholas Tonti-Filippini, if there were to be commercial operation, and there is one small-scale operation in Australia now, but with commercial operation, you have recommended, I think, as part of your report, that in no circumstance should relatives of a deceased person who has made the donation should be allowed to profit from that trade. Is that correct?
No, we haven't supported that, because that would overturn the whole altruistic system.
No, that's what I'm saying, that you would be opposed to relatives of a family member who is the donor actually taking a share of the profits.
This altruistic donation in Australia that we have is a very important part of our social capital. It's one of the things that you can admire about Australia, that we've got a blood bank and a bone marrow bank and the organ transplantation network all operating on altruism, and that's great, and we should preserve that. There's a huge danger if for-profit companies enter into this area that could be undermined, and that's one of our major concerns as a committee, that we need to regulate this area in order to prevent for-profit organisations taking over and thereby undermining the whole system.
Nicholas Tonti-Filippini, Stefan Poniatowski, thank you both very much for talking with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And that's the program for tonight. Next week on Four Corners, an investigation that reveals that one of Australia's great national icons, the koala, is in serious trouble, a trend that may be too late to reverse. Until then, good night.